Okay. Yeah, maybe we can start and then let everyone join us. So Shavua Tov and welcome everyone to this evening's shiur. Hopefully our last online Midreschet event. It's my pleasure to invite Rav Nechemya Taylor as our speaker this evening. Rav Taylor has been teaching at Bar-Ilan University in the Institute for Advanced Torah Studies for 30 years, supervising graduate, postgraduate and doctoral students in the fields of Tanakh, Halacha, Talmud, Smicha training, Dayanut and Jewish philosophy. He developed curriculum for rabbinic training programs for rabbis to serve in communities outside of Israel. Rav Taylor also teaches at the Bar-Ilan University Midrashah, where among other courses, he's involved in teaching and preparing women for the examinations of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel's Toanot Rabbaniyot examinations. Rav Taylor gives regular shiurim all over Israel in Gemara, Tanakh, and Jewish philosophy, and is a communal posek in Hilchot Nida and all spheres of halacha. In the early 90s, Rav Taylor taught at Midreschet Harova and was the founder and pioneer of the Women's Talmud program. Rav Taylor was also Shaliach of Mizrahi and Bnei Akiva South Africa for several years. For 12 years, he was the rabbi and spiritual guide for the Mekor Chaim community in Petach Tikva. He's also served as a scholar in residence in many communities around the world. Rav Taylor published a book on the halachic philosophy of Ramban titled Zohar Ta'aseh L'Teva, as well as authoring many articles in halachic journals and books. The title of tonight's shiur is Zooming into Sefer Bereishit. Before I hand over the Zoom to Rav Taylor, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions, you can write in the chat, and Dudi will then select people or call on people to ask their questions. And if you can see in the chat, for those of you who haven't yet had a chance to print out the source sheet that Rav Taylor prepared, you're able to click on the link to have access. Rav Taylor, it's an honor to have you speak with us tonight. Thank you.
Shavua Tov, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. What I want to speak tonight about is not necessarily only about Sefer Bereishit, but it's an introduction to understand the multifaceted ideas and ways which the Torah portrays itself. Now, what do we mean by this? Okay, the basic idea which I want to show you tonight is how to learn and look at Torah shebichtav. Look at the parsha, look at the words of the parsha, and see the patterns, the different perspectives of the sentences and the words of the Torah. Now, to understand this idea, let's start off with basic axiom principles, which we have to understand or know when we begin to learn Torah. Let's start off with one of the principles of the Rambam. The Rambam, as we know, wrote 13 principles of faith, which are based on the introduction to the 10th perek of Masechet Sanhedrin Chelek, which speaks about the people who don't have Olam Haba, and they speak about the people who are Kofrim, who deny Torah shebichtav, deny Torah sheba'al peh. And in order to create a dogma of belief, he decided to write 13 principles of faith, his introduction to the Mishnah, and to what he wrote in the 3rd and 4th chapter of Hilchot Tshuva. Some of these principles of faith are mentioned earlier in the Rambam, in Mishneh Torah, and some are brought later. But the principle I want to learn with you tonight is the 8th one. The 8th principle of faith, which is summarized in the Ani Ma'amins, which we all know, some of us say every day, speaks about the concept of Torah min hashamayim, Torah which comes from heaven. Now, what do we mean when we say we believe in Torah min hashamayim? What does it actually entail? Now, the Rambam, in his way, is very dogmatic. Okay, there were great commentators and great rabbanim who argued with the Rambam on certain of his principles, like the Sefer Ikarim, the book of principles, which is later on by Rabbi Yosef Albo. But the Rambam creates for us a certain dogma of belief. And let's start off in line number 5. The Rambam there says, Vayesod Hashmini, and the 8th principle is Torah min hashamayim. V'hu shenamin shekol haTorah hazot hanitzet biyadeinu hayom hazeh. The Torah which is in our hands this day is the Torah which is given to Moshe. V'shi kula mipi hagvura, and it comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Klomar shehigia elav kula me'et Hashem. It all came from Hashem. Haga'ah. Now this is the terminology, a very important terminology which the Rambam uses. Haga'ah. It reached him. Shekorim ota al derech hashala dibur. Now, the way it came to Moshe Rabbeinu, if we want to try to use modern day language, we would use the word, the Rambam says, speech. HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaks to Moshe. But, the Rambam says, Eino yodea eichut ota haga'ah. What is the quality of this speech? What do we mean? HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaks, which obviously he doesn't speak. Because speech, you need basically vocal cords, and you need a brain to transfer your thoughts into speech. That is what speech is. Says the Rambam, it doesn't work like this with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But we use terminology in relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which we do not understand. We don't understand how Moshe Rabbeinu interpreted the way which HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictated to him the Torah. We don't understand that. That is the realm of prophecy. And the realm of prophecy, which happened to be so clear to Moshe Rabbeinu, is, says the Rambam, a way which we cannot understand. And therefore, says the Rambam, this is a principle of faith. We have to accept this idea, HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaking to Moshe, in inverted commas, and what does Moshe Rabbeinu do? And now comes the next line, in line number 8. Ve'ein yodea eichut oto haga'ah, ela hu alav hashalom asher higia elav, v'shehu Moshe Rabbeinu ba'amalat livlar. He's like a scribe. HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictates to Moshe letters. And from the letters come words. And from words come sentences. Any of us who ever looked in a Sefer Torah will not find sentences. When we look at a Torah, we see a sequence of words. Bereishit, bara Elokim, et hashamayim, et haaretz, v'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu, etc., etc. Where does a sentence begin and where does a sentence end? This, says the Rambam, Moshe Rabbeinu did not necessarily, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not tell Moshe Rabbeinu where the sentence ends and where the sentence begins. Now, the next stage is, therefore, how do we know that we are reading the words in a correct way? How do we know the sentence where the sentence begins and where the sentence ends? Now, this is another dimension of belief. Belief that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictates the Torah to Moshe, he also tells him how to read the words, Bereishit. He also teaches him that the end of the first sentence is Bereishit, bara Elokim, comma, et hashamayim vet haaretz. Punctuation. Therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu words, he tells him sentences, etc. But it's not only that, he also tells him how to pronounce the words. For instance, to give you an example, every single day we say in Shema, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. V'ahavta. How do we know the interpretation of the word? This word v'ahavta can mean either you loved, and then excuse me, the word v'ahavta can either mean and you loved in the past tense, or you will love in the future. And then the vav is not a vav of and, but the vav is a vav hahipuch, a vav conversive, and not a vav conjunctive. Now, how do we know that? Therefore, we have to have another dimension. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu teaches Moshe Rabbeinu not only sequences of letters into words, but he also teaches him how to say the words and how to punctuate a sentence. What we know nowadays as Tamei HaMikra. Tamei HaMikra actually tell us how to punctuate a sentence and how to stress certain words. Do we say v'ahavta or v'ahavta? If you say it's v'ahavta and therefore the metek, the stress is on the beginning, it means you loved. V'ahavta, future tense. Now, if this is correct, we have another dimension of our belief in Moshe. Not only do we have to believe that Moshe was a scribe and he received the words and he was dictated the letters, he also received from HaKadosh Baruch Hu how to punctuate a sentence and how to say words. And then even more than that, he has the explanation of the sentence, what we call halacha l'Moshe Misinai, how to explain the sentence. Now, all this is included in our belief in Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, let's just go to one statement of the Ramban in line number 20. In line number 20, the Ramban says, in one of his articles on Kabbalah, but that's not important to us at the moment, he says the following, Utchila ma shera'u lanu limsor lecha, ki atnuot, the vowels, hein kedimyon hatzura, va'otiyot kedimyon hachomer. We have what we call substance. The written letters are like substance, chomer, material. Who gives life? Or for instance, you have a computer and the hard disk. You still need the software in order to be able to use the data in the hard disk. The vowels and the Tamei HaMikra, the punctuation, are like the software of a computer. They give the letters a form. Because from the letters which are written in the Torah, the words, you receive an interpretation. Surah, form, to the chomer, the substance. And that the Ramban says, V'hinei surah mani'a et hachomer. The format moves the data in the hard disk. The software enables you to interpret all the data which exists in the hard disk. Without the software, without Windows, you couldn't apply anything. And therefore the Ramban says that we have to believe that Moshe Rabbeinu gave us 4 dimensions. We accept him as the scribe of the letters. We accept him as telling us how to read these letters. We accept him as the person who taught us how to create from these words sentences. And then he will then give us interpretations of what God handed over to him at Sinai. That, says the Ramban and the Rambam, the interpretation of Torah min hashamayim, multifaceted. So many different facets we have to accept when we believe in Torah shebichtav. Axiom number 1. That is the first axiom. After we've accepted this axiom, then we ourselves can begin to interpret the Torah. We can give our own aspects, but there's certain things which we have to accept as axiomatic when we learn Torah. Now let's go to stage number 2. How is it written? And especially Sefer Bereishit. Now, the Ramban is an introduction of the Torah to Sefer Bereishit, says the following, line number 15. Sorry, before we get to that. Umipnei zeh, because of this, and this adds a new dimension to what we just spoke about, Umipnei zeh, Sefer Torah, sheta'abo ba'ot achat, b'milah, b'maleh or b'chaser, pasul. Because we believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictated letters to Moshe Rabbeinu, dictates letters, and from the letters he creates words. Therefore, zeh ha'inyan yichayev otanu lifsol Sefer Torah. If we find a Sefer Torah which is missing a letter, it will become pasul. Why do we take out a new Sefer Torah? It's only one letter. The answer is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu, first of all, dictates letters to Moshe Rabbeinu. And he says the following in line number 17, so the end of line number 16, even though this is totally illogical, there's a missing yud, there's a missing vav, there's a missing aleph, which anyway we don't say. What difference does it make? No, the aleph in Amar means that there's an aleph there. HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictated to Moshe Rabbeinu the letter aleph. V'zeu ha'inyan she'eviu gdolei ha'mikra limnot kol maleh v'chol chaser. That's why Ezra Sofer are known as Sofrim. When we go to a Sofer, his job is not to write, first of all, tefillin. Then he's a kotev. Why is he called a Sofer? Because the original people were those who counted the letters of the Torah. And they are the ones who, in actual fact, created for us the first dimension. Number 2, Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to heaven and receives. What does he receive? Line number 25. After the giving of the tablets of stone, the Aseret HaDibrot, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Hashem says to Moshe, Ale elai ahara, come up to the mountain. Ve'etna lecha, and I will give you et haluchot ha'even, the tablets of stone. Ha-Torah, Torah, mitzvah, asher katavti lehorotam. So he gives him 3 things. He's going to give him 3 things. He's going to give him tablets of stone. He's going to give him the mitzvot. What does the Torah mean? Says the Ramban is an introduction. Moshe Rabbeinu katav ha-sefer hazeh. Moshe Rabbeinu writes this Torah, kulam mipiv shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'akarov וכתב זה בהר סיני. He writes it on Har Sinai, כי שם נאמר לו. There it says for him. עלה אלי ההרה, go up on the mountain. ויהיה שם and be there, ונא לך את לוחות האבן והתורה והמצווה. כי לוחות האבן, what are the tablets of stone? Those are the tablets. מכתב means, לעשרת הדיברות. מצווה, מספר המצוות, כולם עשה ולא תעשה. What is the Torah? Says the Ramban, the Torah is, and the most important word which he's now going to say, יכלול הסיפורים מתחילת בראשית, כי הוא מורה אנשים בדרך בעניין האמונה. Torah, until Matan Torah, until Moshe Rabbeinu goes up, and from then onwards starts the whole story of the Mishkan and the golden calf. What is Sefer Bereishit therefore? Emunah, belief in God. Torah teaches us emunah. That is Bereishit. Now, how does this work? I'm jumping over 3 lines. Val kol panim. Sefer Bereishit is very peculiar because, says the Ramban, if Bereishit was given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe, why doesn't it start off by saying, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe le'emor, Bereishit bara Elokim? If God is dictating to Moshe Rabbeinu, then it should say, says the Ramban, God says to Moshe, Bereishit bara Elokim. Says the Ramban, no. ועל כל פנים, היה נכון שיכתוב בתחילת ספר בראשית, וידבר אלוקים אל משה על כל הדברים לאמור. אבל העניין להיכתב סתם, מפני שלא כתב משה רבנו התורה כי מדבר בעד עצמו. Moshe doesn't speak about himself. The Torah, until Moshe Rabbeinu began speaking to Am Yisrael, there is a narrator. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the narrator of the Torah. There is a narrative. And Moshe Rabbeinu receives it in a way that God is telling him a story at the beginning, and therefore there's a narrator. And what does the narrator say? The author of the Torah, whoever that might be in inverted commas, is telling us, Bereishit bara Elokim. The narrator is telling us, in the beginning, God creates the world. But that's a narrator. God doesn't speak about himself. He doesn't say, Ani barati et haolam. I created the world. It is written in third person because, okay, I'll speak about that in a minute. A good question. Right, I'll come back to that. Okay. What have we got here? We've got God speaking to Moshe. Okay, God speaking to Moshe, but God dictates the word as if he's the narrator. Now, how do we know, where does this narrative take place? Now, let's give ourselves an example. In next week's Parsha, we know that Moshe HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to destroy Sodom and Amorah. And he comes along, HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes along and says to us the following. Let's see the sentence. Please turn over the page. Hashem Amar, line number 44. Hashem Amar, God says, Hamachaseh ani me'Avraham, asher ani Yosef. The narrator of the Torah, of the story, says the following. God is saying to himself, can I hide anything from Avraham? Now take note. The narrator, who's God, speaking about himself in the third person. I, the narrator, am saying about God. Can I hide anything from Abraham? Because I know, ki yidati, Leman asher yitzaveh banav ve'beito acharav. I know, God is saying, telling us in the Torah, I know that Abraham Avinu will carry on commanding his children and his household, and they will keep v'shamru derech Hashem, la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, leman avi et Hashem el Abraham asher diber. This is the narrator telling us about what God is going to do. He now says to himself, I'm not going to hide anything for Abraham. But please take note, it's written in the third person by the narrator of the Torah, when the narrator of the Torah is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he's speaking about himself in third person, because the Torah wants to give us a feeling that there is an objective writer. The writer changes. Now, what do we mean by the writer changes? Now, the best example for this is the following. Sometimes God speaks about himself. He narrates to us, Bereishit bara Elokim. He sometimes will speak about himself, I'm not Elokim. I am Yud Kei Vav Kei. Sometimes I am Kel Shakai. Sometimes I'm Tzvaot. I'm multifaceted. But he's telling it to us from his perspective as the narrator. And the Torah doesn't want to say, I am this and I am that. No. It's speaking to us in different facets. Sometimes in the facet of Elokim, sometimes in the facet of Yud Kei Vav Kei, sometimes in a different facet. Notice of these different facets. Yes.
We lost you the last half a minute.
Okay, it says here
just repeat
your connection with. Okay, right. Okay. I think the words I said were the following: the Torah speaks. HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaks to us from many different perspectives. He speaks to us from a perspective of Elokim. He speaks to us from a perspective of Yud Kei Vav Kei. Each one of these different facets for different reasons, to teach us different dimensions and perspectives. So we have many, many different ways of looking at the Torah. And this gives us the ability to understand it in different ways. Now, in order to understand this dimension of the multifaceted perspectives, let's look at how Sefer Bereishit builds itself up, the beginning. If we look at the Sefer, look at the Torah divides up, there are different parshiot. There's a Megillah, we're going to use the term Megillah, we won't go into that at the moment, which speaks about creation. There's a Megillah, which speaks about Noach. There's a Megillah, which speaks about Avraham. There is a Megillah, which speaks about Yitzchak. Each section has its own different Megillah. And in this Megillah, there are what? Different facets. Okay? You take two parshiot of Avraham Avinu. Lech Lecha, Vayera. Two dimensions of Avraham Avinu, how God sees Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu as the founder of the Jewish nation, with all the potential that it's given to him through all the different covenants, and then how he brings it out into action. Parshat Vayera speaks about Abraham's actions. The final action is obviously the Akedah. But that's Avraham Avinu. Each one has got a different side to it. But let's take note of Bereishit. Bereishit bara Elokim. The first word in the Torah which relates, the first verb which relates to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the word bara, creation. We do not know how to create. We do not know how to create something from nothing. That is creation. And that's why the only time the word bara is mentioned in the Torah is in relationship to God. Bria, yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. The next verb, which appears in the Torah of creation, is vayitzer. Take note in line number 56. Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam. Vayitzer is giving form. You have a person who has clay, and he gives a form to the piece of clay. That is surah. All of us can make surot, forms. We just don't know how to make the initial first piece of material. That is bria. And then we have the final one, number 6, in line number 60. Vayas, God makes. The world of bria, creation. The world of yitzira, creating form. And then we have the word asiyah, you make. You make. The closest thing which you've got is that you have a person who makes glass. He blows into the glass, creates a form. And then finally, he gives the final touches to the glass. That is asiyah. But then there's another dimension, which we spoke about in this week's parsha. And this week's parsha is what Avraham Avinu teaches us. Now let's look at the words. At the end of the war of the 4 and 5 kings, we have Umalkitzedek Melech Shalem, Hotzi Lechem V'Yayin, V'hu Kohen Le'el Elyon. He's the high priest. Vayivarcheu, Vayomar, Baruch Avram, blessed be Avraham. Avraham Avinu should bless Le'el Elyon, the Most High God. Koneh Shamayim V'Aretz, the one who has acquired Shamayim V'Aretz, the one who owns. When you own something, when you buy something, you own it. Now, Avraham Avinu says the same thing, but let's take note of it. Vayomer Avram el Melech Sodom, Harimoti Yadi El. Now comes the word. He adds an extra word to what Melchizedek says. Yadi El Yud Kei Vav Kei, Hashem Kel Elyon, Koneh Shamayim V'Aretz. Avraham Avinu adds another word, another name to God here. Says Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. This is perhaps the most important dimension of Avraham Avinu. Melchizedek, says Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, היה כהן לכל עליון, ואברהם הוסיף אל השם הזה את השם המפורש, שם הוויה. שם זה רומז שיש יחס מיוחד בין כל עליון קונה שמיים וארץ, לבין מעשה האדם וגורלו. There is direct contact between God and man. God does not create a world and leaves it. He is there constantly. Yud Kei Vav Kei. Haya, Hove, V'yeh. Was, is now, and will be. Says Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Hakel Elyon shel Melchizedek היה שונה רק באופן כמותי מן האלוקים האחרים. The God of Shem was only a God greater in quantity than other idols, than other gods. הוא היה כל עליון בקרב האלים. הקל עליון של אלילות היה אלוקי הטבע, God being the master of nature. The others, there was the God of the sun, there was the God of the moon. HaKadosh Baruch Hu in quantity takes over all of them. ואילו אלוקי אברהם איננו רק אלוקי הטבע, אלא ובעיקר אלוקי ההיסטוריה. The God of history. Yud K Vav K. You have in the world the scientific geographical world, the Chomer, and then you have God who gives mashmaut, values to the world. He gives us dimensions. He's with us. And the whole of the story of Sefer Bereishit speaks about God accompanying and directing man. Mishekalta melechet Hashem bateva. When God finished creating the natural world, Heichela melachto behistoria. His words begin in history. That is the word historia, the hester, the hidden side of God. That is history. The hidden, hester means hidden. The hidden side of God. When we learn history, we learn the hidden side of him. Is he there? Isn't he there? Sometimes we see him, sometimes we don't see him. Says Rabbi Shimon Feinersh, Me'az Hashemu ma'aleh umorid. He uplifts and brings down. Manhig directs. Ikar melachto le'atid lavo. V'lo bizman ha'avar. It's not history, it's now. It's planning, etc., etc., etc. So Abraham gives us a new dimension to God. He's Hashem who owns the world. Let's just look and controls it. Now let's look at the last story of Sefer Bereishit. The last story of Sefer Bereishit speaks about Yosef. And what does Yosef say to his brothers? Vayishlacheni, line number 85. Vayishlacheni Elokim lifnechem. You think you sent me? No, you didn't send me. God sends me. Yosef is now giving his brothers a lesson in history. He's giving him a lesson. He's telling them, no, you didn't do anything. God sent me here. Lashuv, lasum lachem she'erit ba'aretz. Ulachyot lachem lifleita gdola. As a remnant. And he says, va'atem, ata, and now. Lo atem shlachtem otihem. You didn't send me. God sent me. Ki Elokim vayisimeni la'av leparo ula'adon lechol beito u'moshel b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. You didn't send me. God sent me. And how does Sefer Bereishit end? Vayomer aleihem Yosef. Al tira'u. Don't be scared. Don't worry. Ki atem, ki atachat Elokim ani. Am I in place of God? Va'atem, you, when you sold me, you thought it was bad. Va'atem chashabtem alai ra'ah. Elohim, God, chashava letova. Leman asot kayom hazeh lachyot amra. So in this way, I could feed and give life to a whole nation. Avraham Avinu teaches Melchizedek that your God is only a God of nature. I am telling you that God is a God of history. he accompanies man. What's the last word of creation? ויכל אלוקים ביום השביעי מלאכתו אשר עשה, וישבות ביום השביעי מכל מלאכתו אשר עשה, ויברך אלוהים את יום השביעי ויקדש אותו, כי בו שבת מכל מלאכתו אשר ברא אלוקים, which God created, לעשות, to do in the future. What I'm doing now at the end of creation is preparing the future. And I will never stop preparing the future. That is the hidden side of God. That is the history. And Avraham Avinu is teaching Melchizedek, the king of Sodom, his greatest lesson. Don't think that our God is just a great God who created nature. It's far deeper than that. He controls history. And a historical perspective is always, how do we see the hand of God in history? That is why the book is called Bereishit, time. Time is a function of history. We all live in a framework of time. And therefore, the true explanation of the word Bereishit bara Elokim is God creates time. It's not in the beginning God created. In the Septuagint, they all translated Bereishit bara Elokim, God creates time. And we all live in a framework of time. And the hidden side of God is not that the sun rises and the sun sets, but how he accompanies us through time. And that's why the book of Sefer Bereishit ends speaking about God working in the framework of time. Only after you understand God working in the framework of time, you can go to the next stage. Shmot, names. Names, the explanation of the word names is identity. After we understand God working in the framework of time, he then wants to explain to us what is identity, because the name of an object, it's its identity. And the whole of Sefer Shmot is the development of the identity of the Jewish people. That's why it's called Shemot. It is the identity of God, the names of God, and the identity of the Jewish people and their objectives in the world. That is Sefer Bereishit. Now, the minute you begin to look in Sefer Bereishit in those dimensions, then you will see and you notice words. And when God uses, the narrator of Sefer Bereishit uses his different names, Yud Kei Vav Kei and Elokim, to give yourselves an example. Brit Bein Abtarim, which speaks about the timeline of history. The only name which is mentioned is Yud Kei Vav Kei. Brit Milah is Elokim, because we're speaking about there, not in the framework of history, but the job of man within nature, etc., etc., etc. And the most important thing is when we look at how the narrator of Sefer Bereishit, because remember, Sefer Bereishit is one of the only books where God appears as a narrator. After that, when Moshe Rabbeinu comes into the world, then God is speaking to Moshe, and you feel that Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking. Bereishit and Parshat Ha'azinu is the narrator, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu, speaking to us. That's how we have to look at Sefer Bereishit and the Torah. The Torah is first of all a list of letters. And after we have the sequence of letters, you go into how you say these letters and how you build up words and how you build up sentences, etc., etc., etc. That is one thing I wanted to speak to you about tonight. Those are the different dimensions, okay? And let's go into one more concept, which I want to speak to you about. The names of God and how they appear. Now, how does God appear to us as Elohim? God appears to us as Elohim in the first sentence. The first sentence of the Torah. Bereishit, let's look at it in the first words of the Torah. It says the following, line number 95. Vayomer Elohim, vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tzalmo. B'tzelem Elohim bara oto, zachar nekeva bara oto. HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates man. And what's the first commandment to man? Vayivarech otam Elohim vayomer alehem, pru urvu, multiply, umilu et haaretz, v'kivshua. Urdu b'dgat hayam, uv'of hashamayim, uv'chol chaya haromeset al haaretz. And what happens? Man has got one job in the world to do. His main job is to multiply, to build up the world. Take note of the words. Pru urvu, milu et haaretz, kivshuha, conquer it, make the world a better place. Now, man does not succeed in his job. Another 1,500 years later, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? What does God see? Vayhi, kechel ha'adam larov al pnei ha'adama. Line number 100. Ubanot yudu lahem. Vayar Hashem, and God sees ki rabba ra'at ha'aretz ba'adam. V'chol yetzer machshavot liba rak kol hayom. Man doesn't want to create anymore. He's making a mess of the world. Makes a mess, a huge mess. And therefore God brings the flood. Now why? How does God plan the world? What happens here? And for this, I want to explain to you, learn with you, the first Ramban on the Torah. Why, asks Rashi, the first Rashi in the Torah, why doesn't God start off with mitzvot? And Rashi gives his interpretation. But the Ramban sees it in a different way. And he says the following. Menatan Rabbi Yitzchak tam leze. Ki tchila Torah b'Bereishit, bara Elokim, v'sipur kol inyan ha'yitzira ad briat ha'adam. And he tells us how God created the world. V'hisheim shilo b'masei yadav. God gives him the dominion over everything which he created. V'chol shat tachat raglav. V'gan Eden, shu mivchar ha'makomot hanivraim ba'olam hazeh, na'aseh machon l'shivto. Ad shigiresh oto chet'am misham. What does that mean? Sin causes exile. The sin of man, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? He throws you out of his place. And he carries on and says, V'anshei dor hamabul b'chet'am gurshu min ha'olam kulo. And the sin of the flood, God decides to wipe them all out. V'atzadik b'hem levado nimlat, hu v'anav. V'zar'am, and their sin, and their seed, chet'am garam lahem, la'afitzam b'mkomot, u'lezarotam ba'artzot. Im ken ra'uyu, ka'asher yosif hagoy lachto, she'aved mimkomo, v'yavo goy acher, לרשת את ארצו, כי כן הוא משפט אלוקים בארץ בעולם. Comes along the Rambans and tells us, What is the principle of how God controls the world? God, according to the Ramban, controls the world by seeing man's behavior. Every single nation has a purpose. He fulfills his purpose. He stays in his place. I'll stop for a minute. It's freezing a bit. Every single person in every nation has a purpose. The minute and that purpose, automatically, HaKadosh Baruch Hu exiles him. What we call exile and redemption.
Danke vielmals, einen schönen Abend.
Sorry. Don't know what happened. Okay. Where was I up to? What happened? What the Ramban's teaching us is the following. The Ramban's teaching us is that the objectives of creation and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs history is in actual fact a way that man has his purpose. He doesn't fill his purpose, HaKadosh Baruch Hu exiles him. The first sin of man was Adam Arishon not fulfilling what he was supposed to do. Hashem sends him out of Gan Eden. The next person to sin is Cain. What happens to Cain? He becomes a wanderer. He has no place to live. Galut and Geula, exile and redemption, is the essence of the way God runs history. Nations go up, nations go down. They fulfill their purpose, they go up. They don't fill their purpose, they go down. That was the lesson to Yaakov. Yaakov and the dream of the angels going up, angels going down. Am Yisrael fulfill their purpose, they will stay in Eretz Yisrael. They don't fulfill their purpose, they leave Eretz Yisrael. And that is the cycle which the Ramban sees. Now, sometimes, says the Ramban, this always doesn't work out because there's something else. Because there are two names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There is the name of Elokim, and there's the name of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. And the Ramban seems to say that the first two sins of humanity, one, Migdal Bavel, and one, the flood, HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses the narrator of the Torah, uses two separate names. The narrator, sometimes he behaves as Elokim, and sometimes he behaves as Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Sometimes he uses Midat Adin, and sometimes he uses Midat HaChesed. When it comes to mistakes and sins of behavior, I'll come to that in a minute. When it comes to mistakes of behavior, of immorality, of social injustice, like we see next week, Sodom, or we see in the flood, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses the word, the name Elokim. When it becomes a mistake in understanding religion, God, the people who wanted to build the Tower of Babel, their sin was something completely different. It wasn't social injustice. It was rebellion about a God. Here, the name Yud Kei Vav Kei is mentioned. The narrator seems to tell us how God behaves, sometimes through the realm of Elokim, sometimes through the realm of Yud Kei Vav Kei. And we have to look at history exactly in this way. Sometimes, and the Tower of Babel was also like an exile. It wasn't a physical exile, it was a spiritual exile. It was an exile where we don't understand one another. This is a spiritual exile. It's not a physical exile. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, when he sees different modes of behavior, mistakes in modes of behavior, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us different ways, different actions. And that's the way we sometimes have to behave. When we see social injustice, then we've got to behave in a certain way. When we see mistakes in religion, we also have to begin to work in different ways. And the whole of Sefer Bereishit, the narrator is coming to tell us different dimensions, modes of behavior, how we have to react, and after we behave, etc., etc., etc. And therefore, every time we look in the Chumash, we have to look deep in, first of all, to the words, how they are used, when names are used in a different way, when there's words vayedaber, when the word is vayomer. Every single word has a different interpretation and a different usage. And that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictates the Torah to Moshe in different words and different ideas, because each word has its own idea. And every time we look at these words, we have to understand them according to our perspective. Questions? Sorry, there was chat. Somebody wrote in chat something.
So
Okay.
thank you very much.
I don't understand.
Yeah, we can start with Jean Idler. He asked the question in the chat.
Yes, it is well known that we are not experts in Maleh and Chaser. The Maleh and Chaser in the Talmud is different than ours. Quite correct. Okay? We're not necessarily talking about, let me give you an example. Okay? And here we're going to go a bit. Let's say the word L'totafot. Okay? The word L'totafot can be written in 4 different ways. In Shema, it can be written taf taf pei taf. It can be written taf 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 vav taf pei taf. It can be written with 1 vav at the beginning, 1 vav at the end, or 2 vavim. Which is correct? We don't know. Okay? Which means to say that sometimes the letters which we have a Masorah about, a tradition about, then the Sefer Torah not necessarily becomes pasul. Or you're correct in what you said afterwards, but Tzua Daka can be written in 2 different ways. When does the Sefer invalidate the Sefer and when not? The explanation is that the Masorah, the tradition of writing the Torah, both of them were acceptable. Tzua Daka with an aleph, Tzua Daka with a hey. But both of them were acceptable. In actual fact, the Teimanim, the Yemenite Jews, write it with a hey. We write it with an aleph. Okay? But let's take another word. What would happen if you see the word Bereishit, Bet Resh Shin Yud Taf without an aleph? Or Bara, Bet Resh without an aleph? What would you say then? Here, since there is no Masorah, there is no tradition of Maleh and Chaser, henceforth it becomes pasul. I'll give you another example. Another example is that Rashi has a different Sefer Torah to us. The Rambam had a different Sefer Torah to us. We have a Sefer Torah which was accepted in the year 1000, in the 1500s, which is based on the version of the Minchat Shai, one of the great experts in the Masorah, and that is the Sefer Torah which the majority of the Jewish people have. But the Ramban comes and we're talking about Maleh and Chaser, which there was no tradition about. For instance, what I said to you, Bereishit, Bet Reshin Yud Taf without an aleph. Right. That's question number one. Question number two, why does Yaakov flee? I don't understand so much the question. Can you please explain what you want?
You just had the story about that Adam Harishon had to go away from Gan Eden, and Cain he had to become a wanderer. And then you talked about Yaakov, and Yaakov did, in the Torah sense, nothing wrong. Why did he have to go?
Pardon? To get married. To find his wife.
But he was running away. It was
But he came back.
Came back.
No, I'm saying we're talking about permanent moving. Cain never found a place again. Adam Rishon could never go back where he wanted to. Okay, the greatest miracle of the Jewish people is that after 2,000 years, we've come back to Eretz Israel. That is the greatest miracle. One of the great, Rav Soloveitchik wrote his fascinating article, which he called Kol Dodi Dofek, where he speaks about the knocking of 6 times HaKadosh Baruch Hu knocked on our door in our generation. In our generation, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knocked on our door. And he says, for the Jewish people to come back to Eretz Israel after 2,000 years, that is the greatest knocking on the door for the Jewish people, because it proves that exile was not permanent. It was temporary. We've come back home. And that is the greatest miracle of our generation. Right. Next question. Yeah.
So maybe I would like to have a question, and then afterwards, yes, if anybody has a question, please unmute yourself and just directly ask. So I was wondering, because we brought the story of Yosef, where he basically said that Hashem sent him. Maybe you can add something about how this relates to the topic of Bchira Chofshit, because basically if I he also had his actions, right? Or how do you when do we see ourselves in this big perspective of Hashem is leading the world and putting up and down, and where it's really just our lives?
Okay, it all depends, I think. Okay, it all depends how you perceive and look at your life. Are you basically living in a world of accidents, and that every day is a new accident? Or do you see your life as a purpose? Yosef teaches us that in the end of the day, he sees his life. Now, we can only look back at it in a historical perspective. Okay? In every day we look back in our lives, we can't see the historical perspective. Remember, Yosef sees this after all what he did to his brothers. And Yosef says this at the end of his life. Now, the older you get, the more the historical perspective you have. Okay, a child can't see himself in a historical perspective. Okay, people of 20 also sometimes can't. But the older you get, you see, and you have the ability to see your purpose and where HaKadosh Baruch Hu led my path. Okay, we often don't see it, and that's why history is a macro science and not a micro science. Because in the micro world, it's very, very hard to see. In the macro world of the human being, there we can see the hand of God directing. Okay? That's what Yosef teaches us. And that's why Sefer Bereishit ends dafka with Yosef, the one who we think the most accidental things happened to him. He was hated and he was sold, and he manages to create a purpose for his life. That's where a person sees himself in the world of purpose and not in the world of an accident. Okay.
Thank you. So next questions. So in the meantime, maybe I would like just to add one more.
Right.
So you talked about the perspective, the different aspects of Bria, Bara, Yetzel, and Vayas. So I was wondering what is missing is the dimension of Vayomer, which appears many times.
Sorry?
Vayomer.
Okay. Okay, I'll explain. Okay, I'll explain what you mean. Okay. Let's take ourselves. How do we humans work? We think, okay, we think or we plan in our minds, okay? Often, thoughts which we have remain in your mind, okay? All what goes in your mind is a world of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. Think of an architect. He thinks and plans out in his mind. At the end of the day, he will actually bring it out into public by saying it. The last stage of God, so to speak, is when he speaks to us. That is the final stage. But in the world of Bereishit, there's no speaking because he's got nobody to speak to.
But
only once he has Adam Arishon, then he can speak to him.
No, but in the process of the Bria, there is Vayomer that he says that there will be something.
In the world, okay, that's the word Vayomer. He doesn't say to anybody. It's the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra say the word Vayomer means bringing it out into action, bringing out what do you think, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu plans into action, and that's the word Amirah there. Okay, he's not saying it to anybody. He doesn't say. But we quoted the sentence, Vayomer Hashem, Yimorot Birki Hashamayim. Okay, who does it say to? It says to the sun. It's what we call in Hebrew, Gilui Ritzono, the revelation of his will. Okay, but with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's no such thing as a revelation. With us, we bring out the revelation of our will in the world of speaking. Okay, or writing. In HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's an expression which the narrator wanted to explain to us is a revelation of his will. Anybody else?
Don't have to ask a question.
Marcel?
Yeah, no. Oh yeah, I'm on mute. There are two ways to understand the question of Vayomer, but I'm not sure. When God said Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, Yehi Or. So right. What you ask is Amira a process of creation? And,
correct.
Yeah. So what we can ask is why, for instance, for the Christian in John, first there was the Word, and the Word was creating. Well, but according to what you say, there was no really word of Vayomer. That
no.
No. Yes. So that's the question I want to ask.
I'll explain to you why. Because in the world of words mean, or Vayomer means saying something. Amirah has to be saying something to somebody. Vayomer Hashem El Moshe Lemor. Saying is basically saying to somebody. Now, who does God speak to here? He speaks to some inanimate object which doesn't exist. Vayomer Elohim, and therefore we have to explain it in a way, Dibra Torah Kilshon Bnei Adam. The Torah wanted to speak to us in the way of language. When I want to reveal my expectations or what I want, I use words. Words is an expression of my feelings, of my what I want to do, etc., etc. And that's why Bereishit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. What does he do? How does he express himself in order that something should be created? He expresses itself in the words, or in words. In words. Obviously, God doesn't speak, but in the words give a concept of expression. And that's why the Torah uses these words in order that we can understand, begin to understand how it works. I'll give you an example, okay? And I'll finish off with a famous story that there was a very famous rabbi in Latvia. His name was Rabbi Yosef Rosen, the Rogachover. Now, the Rogachover used to write everything in abbreviations, everything. And he actually wrote, and one of the people who actually tried to work out what he wrote, what he meant, took them a long time to do it, because he wrote just sources, etc., and abbreviations, and you have to work out what he actually means. And there was a young boy, who came to his house once, and he said, "I want to buy your book." So the Rogachover looked at him and he said, "What do you mean you want me to buy my book?" He says, "What, you really think you'll be able to understand it?" So the boy said, "Listen, if I taught me in Cheder, Bereishit bara Elokim, and I understood what Bereishit bara Elokim means, I won't understand what you wrote. If I understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu writes, I can't understand what you wrote." What does this mean? It means that when you're in grade 1, standard 1, first class, you'll understand Bereishit bara Elokim on your standard. Yeah. And when you'll be 80 years old after learning Torah for 80 years, you still won't understand what Bereishit bara means. Okay? The older we grow, the more we know, the more complex things mean. But what I've tried to explain to you today is how to, first of all, look at words. The word Bereishit, the word bara. Why is it written Elokim? Okay, etc., etc., etc. And when we learn Chumash, when we learn Torah, take note of nuances, of how the Torah, the narrator of the Torah, speaks to us, Am Yisrael.
But if you say the word Bereishit means God created time, how does the sentence continue? If Bereishit bara Elokim, if means that God created time, and then you make a comma, and then you say et hashamayim ve'et haaretz.
Correct, I'll explain to you. He creates two things. He creates time and he creates substance. The first thing he creates is time. The next thing he creates is ve'et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. According to that, you need a vav achibur, and he creates shamayim ve'aretz. Now take note, because that is the essence of creation, time and substance.
But there is no.
I agree with you, correct. That's the problem. So then what does it mean in the beginning? What do you mean? In the beginning, it means to say that there was something before God. Okay, I'll just give you one more dimension, one more addition to this. Take note of the first 4 words of the Torah. Bereishit bara Elokim. Bara Elokim et. You take the first 3 words and the next 3 words. The first 3 words, Bereishit bara Elokim, last letters, Taf, Aleph, Mem.
Emet.
Emet. Bara Elokim et. Emet. Okay? Asher bara Elokim la'asot. Emet. Those are the 3 absolute truths. Creation of time, creation of substance, and the concept that HaKadosh Baruch Hu carries on guiding history. Asher bara Elokim la'asot. 3 words, emet. But that's a separate shiur.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I would like to thank you very much. I think it was a wonderful start after a few Parshiot in Sefer Bereishit already, but with a lot of very new insights, at least for me. And hopefully we look forward to welcome you physically in Zurich the next time.
Emet Hashem. Emet Hashem.
Thank you very
Shavuot
much.
Tov, everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Kol
you very
Tov.
much. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Kol Tov. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You can make a hand clapping thing.
Hmm?
Here
No.
we go.